In this lecture, Dr. Riley Dunlap presents a summary of the history and major approaches used by environmental sociology in studying environmental concern and the impacts of attitudes and beliefs on behaviors that reflect environmental concern. He discusses the historic use of survey research to measure and predict environmental concern through environmental attitudes and action. He then highlights frameworks for understanding how to change environmental attitudes and behaviors, and notes that each identifies a different fix for environmental problems. He extends these frameworks to identify relationships between environmental attitudes, beliefs, and values, and notes that contemporary research separates the environmental and concern pieces of environmental concern. He then presents several examples of statistical and conceptual models that depict causal pathways for how environmental concern is generated.
I'm going to try to give sort of a evolutionary, longitudinally, well, temporally based talk, but it's impossible to just do that because I got to throw in some theoretical stuff, some conceptual stuff, some measurement stuff. But in general, we'll move from 1970 to the present. Okay? As you might have guessed from yesterday when we talked about early sociological work on environmental issues, in the late 60s, and especially with the first Earth Day, all these problems are getting attention. Oh, and I need to set my toe. And what do sociologists do? They study the environmental movement and so forth. But one of the first things they do is do surveys. That's what we do. And the typical survey was, there weren't that many, but they were done at local community levels, state levels. A lot of us were at land grant schools. And in those days, you had funding through the ag research centers or experiment stations, but you did a survey in your state and so forth. And then a lot of work was done on special populations. So my very first study with a young faculty member who is a real environmental activist was, as I mentioned yesterday, I believe, based at University of Oregon's students in the first Earth Day. And what we did, he went out and got this known group sample, snowball sampling of some activist groups. He knew a lot of those folks. And I was in charge of drawing the representative sample of undergrads. And then we compared the two. So what this early response reflected is the fact that survey research was very common, very popular in sociology. And especially in the 70s, I would say it was even more dominant than it is today. I think survey research using survey data is still the most commonly used data in sociology, but we have more diverse stuff. Qualitative work has come back to the fore. But historically, and I mean, I'm talking way back 40s, 50s, so forth, face-to-face interviews and mail surveys predominated. So I am doing my bit. I was supposed to talk about survey research, so I have this. But then gradually, with the spread of telephone service, telephones and of course, in more recent years, internet surveys have become very common. And nowadays, a hot thing is mixed mode surveys. You start out, you might mail stuff to people, you get their phone number somehow in the sample, you call them, you try to get their internet. And really, if you want to get on top of this, I can't recommend a better book than Don Dillman's book, which has evolved. Now it's 4 decades. I had the privilege of editing the very first edition in 1974 is how I learned survey research. He was down the hall from me at Washington State University. And his first edition of this, where he talked about the total design method, really revolutionized mail surveys, which had become unpopular. And he showed that through some very careful methods, you could get up 60, 70% response rates with general populations. And all of a sudden around the nation, you hear people, I use the TDM, or I use the Dillman technique. And it's just, he paid me a little bit to edit the book over a Christmas holiday. And I so wish I would have asked for 0.5%. But anyway, why are surveys popular? Well, they're popular because if we use probability sampling, very modest-sized surveys will provide results that can be generalized to very, very large and importantly, geographically dispersed populations. So you can survey, in fact, the adults in the US. And with approximately, if you draw a good sample and get good response rate. We don't have time to go into those details. But with 1,000 to 1,100 people You can get results that have the classic, you hear the phrase, margin of error of 3%, which technically is the confidence interval, at the 95% confidence level. Now you all hear this, somebody, on the surveys on TV, they'll do this, and plus or minus 3, 4, 5. Unless they say otherwise, it's always at the 0.95 level, 95 times out of 100. So you can get very representative results from a fairly modest size sample. But the interesting thing is, I think, and it's always surprised me, the accuracy depends almost totally, till we get to small populations, on the size of the sample and not the population. So if you look up, you do this national survey of the US, I think technically it depends on, they assume you get a 50% response rate, et cetera, and it's something like 1,060 people that you need for the US. How many do you need for the equally accurate sample of Maryland? Like 1,058. It drops like 2 people. And you want to go all the way down to Baltimore. Now you might be talking about 1,020. It just, the population size doesn't make much difference till you get down well under 100,000. Then it has an effect. So. But anyway, so we can get accurate results that represent the, quote, true feelings of this large population through good surveys. Now, back to the main task. So a key sociological contribution of this early literature using surveys, and again, typically of communities and states, but eventually national data, was to try to identify the characteristics associated with, quote, environmental concern. I like to call it EC, primarily because Eric Clapton is a big hero of mine, but it helps me connect interests, but also saves a little space. The concern was to find the characteristics associated with environmental concern, or we call that identifying the social bases of environmental concern, although it quickly became the socio-political basis. And so by 1980, well, by 79, there were about 24 decent surveys that a grad student and I summarized, and it was an early pseudo-meta-analysis. And we published a piece in Public Opinion Quarterly, the social bases of environmental concern, trying to summarize all these studies. And basically across, I think it was 23, 24 of these, the consistent findings that were younger adults, the better educated and politically liberal people were more likely to be environmentally concerned. But the relationships were, while statistically significant, were modest, 0.2, 0.3, seldom over 0.3. And in those days, the results for party preference were pretty weak, often not significant, but when they were, Democrats were more concerned, and typically, but weakly, urban residents more than rural. Over time, there's been some evolution, and in particular, it seems like women and non-whites especially have become more concerned about anything dealing with risk per se, and especially global warming. You might have heard of the white male effect. So when it comes to risk perceptions per se, white males are the outliers. They are just out there. Nuclear is no problem. Way a little toxic food in your belly. But the rest of the population is more risk averse, interestingly. Now this work, on the socio-political basis, has certainly continued, but it was quickly supplemented by studies incorporating a wide range of social psychological characteristics. And we're going to see more about that in the detail. We have to take some more we'll see more about that shortly, but we have to take some more detours here. I want to first note something. I will have some figures. That's another text-heavy PowerPoint, I'm afraid. But why all this interest in attitudes of public opinion, et cetera? Well, we were just interested. We were curious as scholars. But I think underlying that, there was always this sense of, we got to understand how the public sees these things. If we could just see, understand how the public feels about pollution and all these things, these are in the 70s, it will give us some insights. It will help maybe somehow contribute towards solving these problems. So a lot of the surveys, and again, we'll see more on this shortly, focus on things like support for governmental policies, willingness to take, expressed willingness to take environmental behaviors, or at least support government, pay higher taxes, maybe use less energy, give money to environmental organizations. But the implicit and sometimes explicit assumption was that pro-environmental attitudes would in fact generate pro-environmental behaviors. This assumption, while widely held, continuing to this day, has always been very problematic. Now, not being a social psychologist, I'm an amateur one, I decided to draw on a real one. So the best thing I can do for you, a book came out 2012 by, in the acknowledgments, he describes us as sparring partners who, for reasons will become clearer later, didn't get along for a while, but we become good friends now. This book is a superb introduction to environmental attitudes and the whole environmental attitude behavior linkage. I can't recommend it too highly. It's really written for non-specialists, non-sociologists, and non-social psychologists. Frankly, as Tom kind of, when he wrote in there, he says, this may not be the book you wanted, but it's what I want. He's not trying to deal with the cutting edge theoretical developments that are going on primarily within psychology. But if you are a manager or if you're an ecologist and you just want to know about environmental attitudes, I can't direct you to a better place. It's been doing very well. And to introduce the importance of the theme of the book, but again, the importance of the topic, he starts with this thing that's been around a long time. He calls the 3 fixes: technological, cognitive, and structural. These are pretty common. Now, the emphasis here, we got 2 dimensions. I don't know, should I go sideways or downwards first? Okay, let's take this. In America, especially, but many societies, we don't want to mess with people. It's like, that's almost un-American. Anyway, let's just change the environment. We'll use technology. If there's an environmental problem, flooding, we'll build dams. We won't ask people not to live in floodplains or something. So we achieve, in the technological fix, we solve the problem by technology influencing the environment. So I modified this table to focus on global warming only. So proposals to ameliorate global warming via geoengineering. And most of you have heard of some of these bizarre proposals, putting discs in the sky, putting stuff in the ocean. This would be like yesterday, talking about the folks who are keen on the good Anthropocene. We're in charge now, baby. And I'm going like, how well did dams work out? How well, are you kidding me? You're going to experiment with the entire planet and the future of humanity, but it's a good way to do it. And if we leave it to the engineers, they will. So what is the role of attitudes in this model, or this fix? Technology must be consistent with dominant public attitudes and values. And so I suspect many of us in this room are hoping that tinkering with the entire planet's environment is not going to be acceptable in the sense of some of these really extreme geoengineering solutions. Okay, so if you can't do that, what's the next thing you do? Again, especially in America, we don't like to be told, politicians say, we can't tell people what to do. We can't force people to do things. It's got to be voluntary. It's the American way. So we now focus on human behavior. How do we achieve change? Well, we just give the people the appropriate information, and being rational creatures, they will of course change. And so what do we do in global warming? Well, we just increase public awareness. And James Hansen gave his famous testimony in 1988 that put global warming on the agenda. And as you all are quite aware, we've achieved total success now. We've given the public, NSF has funded I don't know how many projects on framing and all these things. And as a result of that, now the American people are totally supportive of action on global warming. And we're about to, cut our emissions by 30%. It doesn't work. 2 problems. First of all, you have to be able to purposely change attitudes. And Heberlein points out that's very difficult to do. Can happen. Secondly, though, we're back to that thing, even if you change the attitudes, will the behavior change? problem. So what do? There's a structural fix. Again, the focus is on changing human behavior, but what you try to change, how you achieve it, is changing the structure of the situation people operate in. And to me, the ideal example would be a carbon tax. That would do it. You want to really reduce greenhouse gas emissions? But the role of attitudes, policies must be consistent with dominant public attitudes and values. A little problem in our polarized society, we'll see. But more importantly, there's a problem with this whole model. We've talked throughout all this, levels of analysis, right? This is very much an individual level of analysis. So when it comes to global warming, what do we have to do? I would change. Policies must be consistent with dominant economic and political actors. Or if Congress won't take the policy, you're screwed no matter what the people want. So this is a case where working just with individuals won't get you there. Now, the cognitive fix remains popular. You all heard it, I hope, the information deficit model. That's how all these efforts were labeled. If we could just increase the public's knowledge, awareness, give them the right info, then things would happen. Again, it assumes that increased public understanding of scientific information on global warming, for example, will stimulate both personal behavioral changes and support for policies. But again, drive this home. It's so difficult to purposefully change attitudes like you want them. And secondly, whether that attitudinal change will produce behavioral change isn't clear. So I'm told, I have the sense that a lot of people here at SYNC don't walk to work or don't ride bikes to work. You drive cars. Well, why is that? Well, apparently the metro system doesn't come here, right? So that's back in that other structural constraints. Individuals aren't free to just do the things. You can't tell people to take mass transit, expect them to, if there is no mass transit available. Okay, at this point, I got to refer you to Heberlein's book. I hope I've whetted your taste. I'm going to ask him to buy me drinks and beer when you buy more books. Drinks and beer, that's a bit redundant. But anyway, things are really complex. He does a great job of laying things out. What I want to do now is get back to the main narrative. I want to focus specifically on sociological contributions to understanding this notion of environmental attitudes, which we typically label concern, and developing more sophisticated models of the factors that stimulate it and pro-environmental behaviors. So here, I'm going to draw on Tom some more, though, for a while, because, again, he's a social psychologist, and I'm not. So he said, environmental attitudes are based on values, built on beliefs, some of which are knowledge or assumed to be. I inserted that. There are a lot of people who think global warming is a hoax or is just naturally, okay. Beliefs can definitely not be knowledge-based. They can be false. But some of which contain an emotional component called evaluative beliefs. Then attitudes have horizontal, and later he points out, and vertical structure, depending on the number of beliefs and values. They have varying degrees of consistency. Other theorists would add in what's called a conative component, ready to engage in behaviors, or even in some cases, actual behaviors. So he takes this example. He's spent his career at Wisconsin, and he's a big out where Aldo Leopold was his hero. And Leopold had this worn-out ranch or some farm area up north where all the pines were gone and so forth, but lots of birches. And Leopold kept planting pines. They would die, but finally some took root. And anyway, I think Tom kind of worships Leopold. So he gives this nice analysis of a paragraph in Leopold's book where Leopold is explaining why I am in love with pines. So he lays it out. Leopold just writes, Tom imposes a structure. So we start at the foundation, values. Values are sort of fundamental beliefs that are deeply held, they tend to be very stable, and they tend to be sort of evaluative. My colleague, Milton Rokeach, who was a colleague at Washington State for a while, define values as desirable end states or desirable modes of conduct. End states like, you see this one, family security, but maybe wealth, success, or a social justice, or freedom. Desired end states, honesty, I'm gone blank, ambition, things like this. Others come along, a guy named Shalom Schwartz, we'll talk about shortly, and just mixes them all together and expands them. But that's the kind of, these are fundamental things. If you believe in freedom, for example, it has a big effect on, well, most of us believe in freedom, but I'm hinting at contemporary, if you prioritize freedom, it might lead you to certain political beliefs. But anyway, then Leopold goes along and says, why do I love pine, Joe? Well, I planted the pine myself, the birch planted itself. Planted trees are by oneself are better. This is kind of an odd thing for a huge figure in ecology, but he's explaining his local area. So this just hints at the complexity of attitudes, but we see attitudes, beliefs, values. You get the picture here. So Tom goes on much later in the book to say our understanding of environmental attitudes is limited because the attitude object, quote, the environment, is alas especially slippery. Now in the reading I assigned, which is basically devoted to the conceptualization and measurement of environmental concern, we go on and say, yeah, it's just really slippery. It's even more complex than Tom points out. To start with, and quite obviously, there are two components, the environmental component and the concern component. So one of the things I and some other sociologists, Tom was doing this, was trying to clarify this. There, as a result of these two components, both of which can have multiple facets, and I'll try to clarify this shortly, you can just get an utterly bewildering array of items. Specific items, agree, disagree, the so-called Likert items we put. And my gosh, people have created more items to measure environmental concern. It's kind of sickening. There was very little consistency, very ad hoc, et cetera. So, but let's take a quick look. What I call a facet, it's a way of slicing up a reality. So what do we mean by the environment per se? Well, one of the things you could do if you wanted to be systematic, you could think about the very key aspects of the biophysical world. And you could make up items dealing with air, probably air pollution, or water, and so forth. Or you could talk about what Bill Catton and I call the drawing on one of the ODMs, kind of the functions of the environment, a simplistic view of what nowadays we call Gretchen Daly and all that, environmental services. But basically, the environment serves as our waste repository, so you can ask about pollution, our resource depot, so you can ask about natural resources, Schneeberg's yesterday, withdrawals and additions, but what Schneeberg left out, and what's so crucial for political ecologists, is living space. And the problem is those waste additions, withdrawals, they screw up living space for people. So you could ask questions about each of these functions, or you could ask questions tapping the outcomes of human activities. Resource depletion versus conservation, pollution generation, abatement, development, preservation. So you got a lot of ways, a lot of ways to slice up the environment. It gets worse. Then you have varying levels of specificity. So people might ask questions that would include the term pollution. Others would use air, water, and I got probably from the late 70s or 80s, an attitudes toward acid rain scale in my files somewhere. So you can get very specific. Clearly, in one of the themes so far, differing spatial scales. Some items focus on local problems, regional problems, national, global, and occasionally people will throw in differing time frames. You put all this together, what a mess. Then, however, the concern component. Here there are two major approaches. One, the Heberlein preferred approach, would be to use various versions of attitude theory. Really, I'm going to measure attitudes, I'm going to measure beliefs, I'm going to measure. But when you put together an agree-disagree item, often it's very hard to separate out a total belief from an attitude and so forth. but you can use those as key facets. There's another approach that I was originally tempted to call the atheoretical approach, but since I use it, and atheoretical kind of has, not such a cool connotation, it hit me what I was really doing all that time was using a policy relevant approach. But here what I mean is, these are the people that put together surveys and set up typically a series of questions asking about the seriousness of environmental problems. What do you see as their primary causes, the preferred solutions? Are you willing to support various things from governmental actions to engage in behaviors? Turns out that most politicians, policymakers, non-sociologists prefer the results. Anyone familiar with the Augean-Fishbein model? You give somebody that thing and, people just try to measure environmental concern. Yeah, often we do include, and here's the key thing, when you ask people to report their behavior, a purist like Heberlein's, it's just another indicator of concern. We don't know if that's really valid. Now, if you go out in the field and get people being active, and Tom did some great early work, one of his classic studies, I'm jumping ahead because the example, but anyway, wanted to, people buy lead-free gas in the old days? So he and his RA would watch at a service station who bought lead-free and who didn't, get the license numbers, and somehow before IRBs and all that, they could interview the two. They had a real behavior, okay? So we have these incredible ambiguities. Not only is environment a slippery attitude object, but the attitudes, and I want to throw in the word opinions, because Heberlein would label that second category often as more opinions. Now, the result is that multi-item scales of environmental concern, the things that we want to use because they have validity and reliability, unlike single indicators of environmental concern that are sometimes widely used by Andrew and me, really it's very hard to address the validity or reliability of a single item, and we can't go into measurement. So people would throw together, quote, scales, and I like to call it the pizza party approach. Some psychologists literally said in an early one, the three of us got together one night, we made up 75 items, we had pizza, blah, 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 and then we did this little survey of students, we factor analyzed it, and we got such and such. Now we got 42 items that hang together, and we go, and you look at those, and you got pepperoni and olives and onions and some 4 kinds of cheeses, and it just happened to hang together. And an early factor exploratory factor analysis, from one sample to the next, the dimensions may shift. But I would look at a lot of these scales. People say, I found these distinct dimensions. And one, I remember, we had 8 items. 4 of them form a support for environmental protection dimension. That's a new scale. And 4 form a preference for economy over environment. And I looked at the content though, and I thought, and then I looked more carefully, and it turns out the first set of items were all worded in a pro-environmental direction, and the second set were all worded in an anti-environmental. So factor analysis will pick up things like question wording direction, if there's a different format, anything that differentiates items that makes some correlate more, it will pull them apart. There were just terribly bad scales out there, and that's why we wrote that chapter, by the way, to try to clarify things. Over time, and especially in the last decade or two, improved methodological techniques, especially confirmatory factor analysis, which you got introduced to, have allowed for the construction of measures of environmental concern that better capture its complexity. And in fact, there was a lot of debate for a while. Can we really talk about something called environmental concern? Or that the issue is just so specific that we have to talk about acid rain, we have to talk about energy totally separately. Okay? So way back in 91, 92, I got my first big break. Someone happened to give my name to the Gallups. And I ended up going from doing surveys in the state of Washington to directing a 24-nation survey. I became a cross-cultural researcher by the seat of my pants. And anyway, in the 24 nations, a pretty short form was typically used, but in a few nations where a Gallup affiliate was willing to pay. I kind of had my almost dream survey. I could use very detailed questions. And a preliminary version of that chapter was in my head, and I kind of designed it as best I could, negotiating with Gallup. They didn't particularly care about my publication abilities. They wanted something jazzy and so forth. But I was able to tap various, again, policy-relevant facets, differing geographical facets, and then there's another NEP called the New Ecological Paradigm Scale that I put together. And it's trying to get at sort of basic beliefs about the relationship between humans and the environment. Do you think there are ecological limits? And I hate to use this term, balance of nature in this room, but for lay people, it works. Should humans dominate nature? So I got a version in there. So anyway, and ex-student and I published a piece, very belated, after CFA came along, and in my case, he came along, to test an expanded model of this, to try to show that, in fact, there was something pretty general that we could call environmental concern. Europeans would call it ecological consciousness, perhaps. And then, as we've learned, what SEM does, the broader aspect, is allows you to include predictor variables as well. So from a 2007 article, I don't know why, I'm blending together old PowerPoints. We put in some items, called the importance of environmental problems, but how important are they on the national agenda? Are they very important to you, et cetera? Support for environmental policies. What do you want your government to do? Another set of some items on environment, economy trade-offs, environmental behaviors and activism. We did put it more, self-reports. The new ecological paradigm, I even slipped 8 items in there. Then, coming to that geographical issue, global environmental problems, start out talking about, the introductory statement says, thinking of the global level, or I forgot so long, and then later, turning to the national, or your nation's environment, and then thirdly, the local. So we had these 8, I would call them facets of environmental concern. So here we go, we've got the CFA model, and gosh, we discovered this. So in the questionnaire, there are individual items over here, each designed to measure community issues, nuclear issues, et cetera. And then the latent variable, the construct we're trying to measure, is this broad notion of environmental concern. I'm not even going to know results here. But basically what we found is that the bottom 6 really hung together very, very nicely. National issues, not quite as well, and local issues, especially separate. And you think about it, wouldn't respondents' answers to local issues differ in, say, New Jersey than Wyoming or something? Okay. So we then proceeded to try to just predict the bottom 6, and then the full SEM model. And I added this at the last minute, and after I had no longer access, and I couldn't get rid of the dark blue box from an old PowerPoint. So here we go. Here are predictor variables. But notice down here, political ideology. About the only thing that was really, really important was education, but some others in both the US and Canada. But the bulk of their effect went through political ideology, but they did have a definite effect. But then again, this is measuring all these. So it really worked pretty well. We got an article and so forth. And amazingly, a survey in China has included the NEP scale and some items, and we published a follow-up article based on a 2003 survey in China, and now we're working on a new piece that adds in 2010. And let's see. So we've so far worked on clarifying environmental concern, and that was a key issue for sociologists. And I think we did a better job than psychologists in that. Okay? Now, though, explanatory models of concern. So only a few sociologists have gone beyond identifying the predictors of environmental concern, improving the conceptualization. The goal has been to develop these explanatory models that can predict environmental concern and in many cases behavior, models that recognize the complexity of the link between these. The 2 key ones have been the norm activation model, and it's kind of more an elaboration on that, now called the norm belief the value belief norm model. So here we go. I gotta rush here. Okay, Heberlein again makes a really classic contribution. His young advisor, Shalom Schwartz, has developed a model of altruistic behavior. And for a minute, skip the environmental norms part. Schwartz wants to know under what conditions, why do people engage in moral behaviors? So imagine you're walking down the street of DC, New York City, whatever. You're on your way to a meeting, maybe an interview, and somebody in front of you just collapses on the sidewalk. And look, and they're in trouble. Awareness of consequences becomes, kind of look, did they just trip? Or, oh my God, could they be having a heart attack? Do they need help? And you say, it looks like they're really having a terrible problem. But you know what? I've got an interview and there's lots of people here. Why should I stop? But some good Samaritans say, if I don't help them, maybe no one else will. So that's the ascription of responsibility. And further, elaborately, he had argued that we were getting not just these general, what I called the golden rule, do unto others as you do unto them, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I'm sorry, trying to rush and be clear. Okay. He was arguing that we're getting environmental norms, but he explained it very interestingly. Science, think Rachel Carson in the early days, was making clear the awareness of consequences of pollution to humans, non-humans, etc. And technology, although it had created terrible problems, DDT, etc., were coming up with techniques of cleaning things up. And so he was arguing that people were becoming aware, we don't have to put up with this pollution, it's bad. And he argued that we were getting environmental norms and people would start to act according to those and it would go down. Now, the problem is, I was really excited and I did a little study in Spokane, Washington, near Pullman, Washington State University, where, as you might imagine, the 70s, they were letting people rake all their leaves up and they could all burn them. All within a few days in fall, a little air inversion, people are going to the hospital, became a big controversy, but should we no longer allow people to burn this? But when I looked more carefully at his work, I realized what had happened is he was arguing that these environmental norms were evidence of Leopold's land ethic finally becoming manifest. And I said, but you're asking mainly about interpersonal consequences, the effect of using unleaded, leaded gasoline for other people, not the environment. I'm not sure you're measuring a land ethic. I think you're just measuring the golden rule. So it was an article, but an article-linked commentary 5 years later on his article called Land Ethic or Golden Rule, we critiqued him. He did not like that. And then fortunately, we got to write a response and he liked that less and we didn't speak for a decade or so. But anyway, we're buddies now. But what's important, that debate it seemed not to have much effect, except Stern, Dietz, and colleagues, that I'm going to talk about next, fortunately credited that debate between us as stimulating their search for environmental, or what they called biospheric values, which ultimately led to this very well-known VBN. Now, before they did that, they just kind of laid out this model. Now, this was a unique collaboration. I mean, Tom Dietz is all over the place, micro, macro, but he teamed up with Paul Stern, originally trained as a psychologist turned environmental scientist at National Academy. So they're just arguing again. Position in the social structure, this is things like, especially this, you can't take mass transit if it's not available, and well-educated people are more likely to know about things, et cetera. Then you've got values, then you've got general beliefs, and they like to use the NEP. Then you get more specific beliefs. This is where AR and AC come in. And finally, you get people saying they're willing to do things, and sometimes you actually get behavior. This model led them eventually to elaborate this. For now, don't look at this. The values are now on the top, but they've laid out this model. Values flow through an ecological worldview, awareness of consequences, ascription of responsibility, personal environmental norms, which led in this study to these different dimensions of activism. They were able to predict all of these kinds of things, especially do you support policies And do you do like green consumption things, environmental activism? Now, interestingly, despite the credit they gave us, Schwartz's second big thing, remember Heberlein's advisor, was to elaborate on Rokeach and develop this sort of model of universal values. It's been used cross-nationally. He went from 36 values to 54 or something. And when they used that, they threw in a few items they thought would measure biospheric values, but they tended to load it with altruistic. And they said, you know, these are sort of self-transcendental values. We can't really, we wanted to, but we can't really find a separate biospheric dimension. Over time, people have done that. But first, let me point out, the VBN, which many people would call a model, not really a theory, sometimes with modifications, I would argue has become the most widely used predictive model of environmental behavior or concern when behavior is not measured in the literature. It's just kind of everywhere. And again, sociologists played a key role in this. But importantly, and drop to the bottom, there's some Augean and Fishbein. There are other models, but I think VBN has surged to the lead. Over time, fortunately, progress has been made in measuring biospheric values. And two of the people that I consider current leaders, Dutch psychologists Linda de Groot and Linda Stegg, and then in America, there's a guy named Wesley Schultz that I think has just been doing the cutting edge stuff. But these folks came up with this. They got egoistic values, people who rank these highly or rate them very highly. Altruistic values, you can see here, I would have maybe, I don't, that's okay. And then what they call biospheric, and I think they lifted this from Dietz and Stern. Knowing Rokeach's work, I wouldn't call preventing pollution a value. I would have put a healthy environment, perhaps. But the key is when you give people these lists, they tend to factor out nicely into these three dimensions, and lo and behold, altruistic biospheric values both predict environmental concern, environmental behaviors, well, they're positively related, and typically egoistic values are negatively related. And that's so really a hot thing going on. Okay, once again, now we're back to the big narrative, major trends in sociological work, and I gotta wrap up quickly, but can't. Much of the early work by sociologists would consist of analyses of opinions, and that's what Heberlein would argue. And increasingly, though, we use data from Roper, Cambridge, and much of these groups that truly are opinions, single item indicators, one item. This work continues as sociologists are often forced to use available data, especially for trend studies. We don't have our own trend studies in those little communities or individual states, national level. Now, an attitude theorist like Heberlein, they views these single items very skeptically. But if you want to, you got to use what you got to use, right? So why does he view them? He says, when attitudes are that way, when attitudes have little cognitive structure, they are weak and often easily changeable, they are opinions. Attitudes tend to be relatively enduring, but opinions can shift. And so he's into fishing. He likes that and navigating it. So the problem with most polls is they ask only one question to measure the like, dislike, favor, opposed dimensions that attitudes, opinions share with attitudes. We get an answer to one question. It's kind of like a nibble on a fishing line. If we want to determine what's down there, its size, its heft, whatever, we got to set the hook with many questions, okay? We got to use multiple items. We got to create valid, reliable. But he's a purist. You know, a social psych theorist, purist. We got to work in the real world. So, working in the real world of available data, one of the key things environmental sociologists have done is longitudinal studies. So in the early years, I think I started writing, did a kind of an overview. There were about 4 or 5 items frequently used in different polling firms and national surveys. So you could blend these together and it provided a pretty consistent picture. I published one in '87, Environment Magazine, one in '91, chapter in '95. The last time I tried to do this, 2002, they were down to 3 items. Some of these firms like Cambridge have gone out of business, others just quit asking the items. And at this stage, we're down to a single item from the General Social Survey on attitudes towards environmental spending. But fortunately, unlike my studies, some very recent studies have become very methodologically rigorous, sophisticated, employing cohort analysis, really trying to see who's changing, why the change is occurring. Fred Pample, I think you say it, and Lori Hunter at Colorado have done some of this work, and it's getting better. One of the key aspects of the trend studies, though, is tracking changes in the correlates of environmental concern. Up until about 90, they seemed to be pretty stable, but like I said, race and class sort of came up. What's really caught my attention, others though, is the emergence of political orientation as the dominant predictor. While ideology, I said, was always significant but modest, party was not even significant. By the mid-90s, noticeable patterns occurred on both party and ideology. So let's take a look at that spending item. From a recent article with Aaron McCright and Shao, the other fellow, my last two students at Washington State, you can see here, real quickly, that 20th Earth Day in 1990 was like the consensual event. It's the highest environmental concern's ever been, not necessarily on this item. This is not the aggregate. On the aggregate, it would be the highest level. But this shows liberals and conservatives. The gap wasn't so different. And then look what happens. We have argued, think about conservatism. Well, you're too young, many of you, but the whole reason for being, or the preoccupation of conservatives for a long time, was communism, fighting communism. That was the biggest threat. And the downfall of the red threat, when the Soviet dissolved in 91, and then next year, there was the Rio Earth Summit and global environmentalism became a force. We argue that the conservative movement substituted to some degree a green threat for a red threat. And this is when the conservative movement really started becoming anti-environmental, not just out west in the Wise Youth movement, but in general. And you can see this cleavage going between liberals and conservatives. You also see later the economic effects on both. But let's look at party. Back in 90, 91, there was virtually no difference. And then a chasm. And again, Newt Gingrich, the Republicans come in. And I mean, so this is the responses. Do you think spending on environmental protection is too little? Most stunningly, though, has been global warming. So in another article, this is from Gallup, just the percentage of the American public that feels global warming has already begun. It's one of 5 items. We got similar results. So for the whole public, you see, what happens here? Obama gets elected, the Democrats come in, and climate change denial folks, fossil fuels, who knew under Bush nothing would happen, now all of a sudden they've got a real threat. You get denial on steroids, I call it. And you also get Climategate. What I want to show you, though, is look, this downturn is totally from Republicans. Democrats, if anything, went up. Again, they came down a little, but in general. And this polarization, and by the way, it hasn't changed in the last 5 years much. What's happened, people have identified that Tea Party, that Larry Hamilton you've heard of, shows that Tea Party members are really out there beyond Republicans. And conservative Republicans, they talk about moderate and liberal Republicans, whatever's are left. There's a difference between them as well. The other big development, cross-national surveys. So we're talking about national stuff, but in early 90s, all of a sudden, something big happened. Gallup's Health of the Planet survey was completed. The International Social Survey Project had an environmental module, and the World Value, oh goodness, 1990 to 93, supposed to be, finally came out. And for the first time, sociologists and other social scientists had 24, 40 plus nations. So all this, we ended up with tests of competing perspectives on sources of international environmental concern. And quickly, Ronald Inglehart, postmaterialism, we've already heard of this. His theory that in post-World War II Europe, as you got growing affluence, you got this shift. instead of worrying so much among younger people, instead of worrying about promoting economic growth, fighting higher prices, people shift to post-material values, protecting freedom of speech, giving people more sane decision-making, and so forth. They had this technique. That proved very useful in explaining the rise of Green parties, anti-nuclear activism. So it was assumed that this would be the way to explain international environmental concern. It was widely assumed that citizens in poorer countries would clearly be less concerned. And this was, importantly, assumption was shared by policymakers. How many of you remember Larry Summers' famous saying, personally, I think Africa is underpolluted. You know, it's we should send stuff there because they value lives aren't so important. They got wide spaces, they can absorb it, and they need the jobs. Didn't go over well. But it turned out, lo and behold, that the health of the planet in particular, but even some of the world values items, found that people in poorer countries were more concerned than people in richer countries. And it led to a long, I like to get in debates. Anyway, a long debate with people over post-material values and the role and so forth. I think a lot of the conflicting results stem, not surprisingly, from different measures, conceptualizations of environmental concern. And in general, if you limit your measures to willingness to pay items, you're more likely to find a positive correlation. You go to some African country and say, would you be willing to pay higher taxes to protect the environment? I'm like, I don't pay taxes. I mean, it's just kind of crazy. A lot of bad items were used that I think weren't relevant. Now with jumping ahead, but there's multi-level models, it looks like what's going on is at the individual level, post-materialism is a pretty good predictor. But at the national level, affluence is not. So we're to the big thing that you've learned so much about, well, many of you know, multi-level modeling, and it's really changed things. It's allowed researchers finally to examine the relative effects of personal characteristics, gender, age, etc., sometimes ideology, with these national level characteristics. And the first thing people did was separate national affluence from people's, if they had data, personal income values. But increasingly, people like Andrew, for example, have brought in a range of factors: urbanization, inequality, democratization, world polity position of the nation, world system theory position. So you can mix this up, and we're getting some pretty nice test of theories. But what's so important to me, vitally, we're also getting national level measures of environmental conditions, which turns studies of environmental concern into studies of societal environmental interaction. So important to me. I had a Japanese colleague once, I gave my lecture at their 10th annual meeting, and he says, Riley, you always talk about the importance of societal environmental interactions, but you just study public opinion. So I finally have gone back to him. I was there in June at a conference. I said, look at this. I've become a real environmental sociologist now. I'll show you why. Anyway, the problem, though, imagine using aggregate level data for the US. Environmental conditions for America, Wyoming. I think the results are pretty shaky still. We need better indicators, we'll get more data, but it is a fundamentally significant development, and sociologists like Andrew have led the way. And especially on climate change. As you all know, we're seeing, we can get all kinds of data from some, in the new cases, some folks out of Yale using an international Gallup survey are doing this cross-nationally, but most of these studies are done in the US. And they look at states, counties, zip codes or something, they get climatological phenomena data, might be the recent temperature of for the year versus a 30-year trend, that's popular, and they see if that has any impact. And those people who are so hopeful that at last Americans will come around when they see all the strange weather, they're very convinced that extreme weather patterns, abnormal heat, etc., is going to change the views. Reality versus ideology, I don't know. Remember the 2012 winter that was so warm in much, but not all of America? So in Gallup, we had this item. Do you think last winter was warmer than, colder than normal, about the same, warmer? Well, and then we created, with only 1,000 people, we had to use the state level. We created temperature deviations that winter over 30 years. the actual temperature in their state was a very good predictor of how they viewed it. If it was warmer, they saw it. But then there was a follow-up question. Do you think this was due to natural variability or to global warming? Actual temperature, absolutely irrelevant. Party and ideology were overwhelmingly the best predictors of the attribution, and they both had independent effects, controlling for all kinds of other stuff. Thank you.